In 2019, a major financial institute experienced a catastrophic data breach, exposing personal information of over 100 million individuals, man. Bad day to be that guy's security engineer, am I right? Okay, I'm talking about Capital One. The root cause of this incident was not a highly sophisticated zero-day exploit. The breach occurred to a combination of things. It was a web vulnerability and a cloud misconfiguration. You see, the attacker exploited a server-side request forgery vulnerability in a web application firewall. This exploitation allowed the attacker to obtain temporary security credentials from cloud metadata services. The attacker then used these credentials to access improperly configured cloud storage buckets containing sensitive customer data. This real-world disaster highlights the critical intersection of cloud-specific and web-based vulnerabilities. Now, securing modern infrastructure requires a deep understanding of how these vulnerabilities manifest and how attackers exploit these weaknesses. Now, in this video, we'll analyze the mechanics of cloud-specific vulnerabilities and web-based exploits to prepare you for passing this CompTIA Security Plus exam. All right, so understanding these concepts is essential for designing resilient architectures and passing this exam, all right? Because you're going to pass this exam, you're going to move on, and you'll be designing this stuff, all right, my friend? Moving your data to the cloud is like moving into a high-tech apartment building instead of the house you own. It changes who's responsible for what. You see, this setup is called the shared responsibility model. Remember that. It will be on your test. Now, it's important that we know that the cloud provider acts as our building manager. They secure the physical building, locks on the main gate, electricity. However, you, the tenant, you're still responsible for locking your door, deciding who gets a spare key, and keeping your valuables safe inside. Security breaches often happen because the customer assumes that the provider is handling something that was actually their job. Now, the most common mistake is misconfiguration. This is just a fancy way of saying that you left your door open on accident. For instance, cloud storage buckets are just digital folders, but they have to get a fancy name because they're in the cloud. And if an administrator forgets to check the private box, anyone with a web browser can look at your files. Now, this usually happens because the settings are complex and it's easy to accidentally give public read access of private data. Now, next up, we have IAM, Identity Access Management. This is a system that manages your digital keyring. A major task here is giving too much power to a single user in an app. In security terms, we call this a lack of least privilege. If an attacker steals the key and has master level access, they can move through your entire cloud environment and take control of everything. We also have to worry about APIs. Now, this is just a fancy way of two apps talking to each other. If these messages aren't properly secured or ask for an ID, an attacker can trick them into handing over sensitive information directly from your database. To stay safe, organizations must constantly double-check their settings and only give employees the exact keys they need for their specific job. Virtualization and containerization is the backbone of cloud infrastructure. Let me give you a quick rundown of what they are. So think of a virtual machine as taking a big server and cutting it into smaller servers. Now think of a container, and throwing an operating system on that, like Windows or Linux. Now think of a container as an even smaller version of that, right? We have a container, maybe it's a part of a larger application and it just handles logons. We give it just enough kind of systems to do that one specific task. That's what a container is. Now, a highly critical but rare cloud vulnerability is virtualization escape or container escape. This occurs when an attacker breaks out of a virtual machine or container to access the underlying host operating system or other co-located virtual environments from there. Now, such an exploit compromises the multi-tenancy model, allowing for unauthorized access to data that belongs to other organizations sharing the same physical hardware. Data sovereignty and compliance also present unique vulnerabilities in the cloud. Data must reside within a specific geographic location to comply with local regulations, such as the General Data Protection Regulation in Europe. Failure to control where cloud providers store or replicate data can lead to severe legal and financial penalties. Transitioning to web-based vulnerabilities, web applications serve as the primary interface for cloud services. Injection vulnerabilities, particularly SQL injections, occur when an untrusted user passes directly into a database to interpret. So this allows the attacker to execute arbitrary database commands by bypassing authentication to receive sensitive records. Now, cross-site scripting, also known as XSS, this occurs when an attacker injects malicious code into a trusted website, and then when a user visits that website, their browser unknowingly runs the code, letting the attacker steal sensitive data like login cookies. Now, stored XSS, this is where malicious scripts permanently are saved on the server and affect all visitors. Reflected XSS, this is when a script is hidden in a link and the user must click that link to activate the attack. Now, to prevent this cross-site scripting attacks, developers must strictly validate and encode user inputs so that the browser threat is treated as a harmless text rather than to execute code. My last name's O'Dirling, O''Dirling. I promise it relates. Now that apostrophe is part of SQL attack. So earlier in my life, I could always put my full last name in signing up for something, Darian O'Dirling. And then now I have to take away the apostrophe because developers have done more of this input validation. Cross-site request forgery, or CSRF, forces an authenticated user to submit unauthorized requests to web applications. The application trusts the request because the browser automatically includes session cookies for that authenticated user. This can result in unauthorized state changes without transferring funds or changing account passwords without the knowledge of the user who logged in. Server-side request forgery, or SSRF, occurs when a web application fetches a remote resource without validating the user-supplied URL. An attacker can manipulate the application and make requests to internal resources, such as the metadata server or internal databases, which are otherwise inaccessible from public internet. Now, this vulnerability was the primary mechanism used in a financial institution breach that we discussed earlier. Directory traversal is also known as path traversal, allows the attacker to access restricted files and directories on a web server. They input specific characters such as ... / sequences so that attackers can escape from that web's root directory, and this exposes tons of systems and sensitive configuration, source files, source code, password hashes. Mitigating these web-based vulnerabilities requires strict input validation, right? Output encoding, parameterized queries, and the implementation of robust web application firewalls, or WAF. Now, regular vulnerability scanning and penetration testing are also essential to identify and remediate these weaknesses before exploitation occurs. I flooded you with so much information. I apologize, but here we go. This stuff's important. So let me give you a quiz question, see where you're at. Which vulnerability allows an attacker to force a web application to make unauthorized requests to internal resources such as cloud metadata services? Okay, a lot of words here, a lot of buzzwords in here. I want you to think of where are web applications hosted. I feel weird waiting. They're hosted on servers, so the answer is server-side request forgery. This occurs when a web application is manipulated into making requests to internal or external resources on behalf of the attacker. All right, remember, Udemy has extra resources. Also, ChatGPT is your friend, so if any of these answer choices throw you off, you forget about them, ask it to explain to you and relate it to your favorite show.